Let the throwdown begin. Let's start with the most obvious, the look of the console. The Genesis has a more modern shape. It looks cool. The Super Nintendo looks like a blocky kid's toy with purple switches. And for some reason, lots of Super NES consoles turn yellow over time. I don't know why, maybe everyone pisses on them. I don't piss on mine, and it's one of the best aged Super Nintendos I've ever seen. The Genesis looks more slick, not counting all the different models and all that crap that gets attached to it, just the original. Winner, Genesis. The Genesis controller is straightforward and simple, 4 buttons if you count start. Super Nintendo, 8 buttons if you count start and select. That makes it way easier to play fighting games like Mortal Kombat. On Genesis, there's not enough buttons. You have to use start to block, and both high punch and low punch are on the A button. With games like Street Fighter that require 6 buttons, you have to hit start to select between punches and kicks, or get another controller. But we're comparing the basic controllers that came with the console. The Super Nintendo has all the buttons you need in all the right places. I can easily press L or R, and my thumbs are still free. In a Mario type game, I can hold down Y to run and push the rest of my thumb onto B to jump. It helps that the buttons are all on an angle. On Genesis, they're all in a straight line. I have to hop my thumb back and forth. The Super Nintendo feels more comfortable. That rounded dog bone shape fits in your hands perfectly. I guess one plus about the Genesis is that you can plug in an Atari controller. That's pretty cool, right? Winner, Super Nintendo. This may seem like a minor thing, but isn't it nice to have something to put your game in? The Super Nintendo games had the standard cardboard boxes, but the Genesis boxes weren't boxes at all. They were plastic cases that snap open. That's a good idea. In retrospect, it's great for collecting too. It's much easier to find a Genesis game complete in the box. With the Super Nintendo, the boxes just got in the way, so most people threw them out. The Genesis cases were progressive, and it's now what every game console uses. Winner, Genesis. Being able to play your old games on your new console is a great feature to have. The Super Nintendo had the Super Game Boy, which allowed you to play your Game Boy games. The Genesis had no such adapter for the Game Gear, although it did have the power-based converter, which was for playing Sega Master System games. This was an official contraption from Sega, but Super Nintendo had an unlicensed version of the same thing called the Super 8, which played NES and Super Famicom games. That makes things pretty even, but thanks to the Super Game Boy, the winner is Super Nintendo. Graphics is a hard one. I've already mentioned the Super Nintendo is technically superior with a greater color palette and all that, and it makes sense to me that a newer console would be more advanced. But look at them. They both look pretty good to me. It really depends on which games you're comparing. Alright Jimmy, so help us out with the graphics. The Super Nintendo just came out, so what do you think?
It's perfect. Look at these graphics. And rotation, like in here, and like in F-Zero, you curve around the racing turns and you could just, and it feels like you're really moving. And it has smooth animation, like suppose someone waving their hand in imagination. It moves it just a notch. Takes 16 notches to move the hand down, and another 16 notches to move it up. So that means it's smooth animation. Scaling.
I'm talking about scaling?
Like, for instance, a car racing away, it shrinks. Super Nintendo has great things that just shrinks as it falls, and it has great resolution. Resolution is a very impressive 512 times 448. That's twice the resolution of other 16-bit video games. Color layering, big characters, and multi-color scrolling backgrounds.
Whoa. I think my younger self just went way over my head. So how does it all stack up today? Well, I think both systems are very comparable, but the Super Nintendo impresses me still just a little bit more.
I say the 16-bit Super Nintendo is a bit better than Genesis. Ha! Get it? A bit better?
One thing that helped push it over the line was the FX chip used in games like Doom and Star Fox, which helped to render three-dimensional shapes. This was a new achievement later in the Super Nintendo's lifespan, which made it exciting that our 16-bit console could improve itself. The Genesis, on the other hand, was on life support, using hardware add-ons like the Sega CD and the 32X, just to accomplish the same thing the Super Nintendo already could.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? Huh? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one? There is no Nintendo CD.
I never understood the purpose. You have to own a Genesis to play a Sega CD or a 32X. Winner, Super Nintendo. When it comes to sound, there's no question about it. The sound effects on the Super Nintendo were far superior. And the music on the Super Nintendo just got me so pumped up. It is fair to say that they're both two different things, that each console both had their own distinct style. I will say, as much as I love the orchestral cinematic sound of the Super Nintendo, I also love the gritty, heavy metal sound of the Genesis, too. Games like Earthworm Jim sounded better on the Genesis. So there are exceptions, but most of the time, the Super Nintendo rocks the competition. It's the first console I ever heard where it crossed the line of video game music and just started to sound like real music. The Super Nintendo has some of the greatest video game themes ever. Winner, Super Nintendo. Both consoles had a great library of games. Genesis had Altered Beast, Moonwalker, the Shinobi games, Strider, Toe Jam and Earl, and the best version of Ghostbusters that existed back then. Super Nintendo had Pilot Wings, the Mega Man X games, and the best version of SimCity around. A lot of the same games that crossed over to both consoles came out almost the same and are hard to compare. Aladdin is an example where both versions are completely different from each other. In this case, the Genesis version is way better. All the Konami games are different, such as Ninja Turtles. Genesis got the Hyperstone Heist, and Super Nintendo got Turtles in Time. These games are similar, but you can't beat Turtles in Time. Genesis got Contra Hard Corps, while Super Nintendo got Contra 3. Again, both are similar, but on the Genesis version, you could choose to play as different characters, including a wolf, and it didn't have that annoying overhead stage like in the Super Nintendo version. What were they thinking? Genesis got Castlevania Bloodlines while Super Nintendo got Castlevania 4. Both are great, but Castlevania 4 blows my mind with its smooth control and creepy graphics. One of my favorite games of all time. Adventures of Batman and Robin. Both versions have awesome graphics that resemble the animated TV series that it's based on. But the Genesis version just nails it this time. It has the cutscenes that the Super Nintendo version's missing, and the stage graphics have a lot of three-dimensional depth. There seems to be a myth that Genesis is more of an adult console. That may be true that Nintendo seems to target younger audiences, but it's not all rainbows and flowers. All the hubbub comes from the first Mortal Kombat game. The Super Nintendo took out the blood and altered some of the fatalities. The Genesis version also didn't have the blood until you turn it on with a secret code. Starting with Mortal Kombat 2, Super Nintendo brought the blood back full on, so now it's a moot point. Super Nintendo had blood in Doom Troopers and in Doom, so there's no way you can say it's just a kiddie console. Even Nintendo's own branded game Super Metroid was dark in tone and overall badass. Both had their share of fighting games, but Killer Instinct, come on! It wasn't the same as the arcade, but it's still the best exclusive 16-bit fighter by far. The beat-em-up genre. Genesis had the Golden Axe games, Alien Storm, and Streets of Rage. Everyone always talks about Streets of Rage, but Super Nintendo had the Final Fight games. The first one didn't have a two-player option like the arcade, but they rectified that with the sequels. I don't know what it is, but beat-em-up games always feel more fun on the Super Nintendo. On the Genesis, they're a little bit clunky. On Super Nintendo, the action is smooth and it just feels right when you hit people. Genesis had more sports games, I'll give you that any day. You can keep your sports games, so if that's your thing, your console is Genesis. The RPG department, Super Nintendo just kills it. Final Fantasy III, which is actually 6, is one of the best games ever made. You can't compete with that. And that's not to say Genesis didn't have its share of RPGs. There was the Phantasy Star games, of course, but Super Nintendo also had Chrono Trigger, another masterpiece. That's a 1-2 punch. And also there's Super Mario RPG. It may seem gimmicky to make an RPG just to include Nintendo characters, but it's a really fun game and much better than what most people may expect. Both consoles had their share of bad games. Super Nintendo had Wizard of Oz, Genesis had Action 52, and both consoles were unfortunate enough to have Shaq Fu. Then of course there's Sonic the Hedgehog and Super Mario World. Which is better? It's all a matter of preference. I will say Sonic 2 was the game that made me buy a Genesis. But even with all the Sonic games, I still could never live without Super Mario World. It may not have the fast speed action, but it has lots of power-ups, fun challenge, and an incredible world to explore. After all, it is Super Mario World. I love Sonic, but I feel with a good Mario game, there's just a little bit more to it. If there's one platformer that can top Super Mario World, it's the Donkey Kong Country games. They're so addicting that just trying to record the footage here, I had trouble turning it off. I wanted to keep playing. Between the Super Nintendo and Genesis, it all depends on what kind of games are your favorite. Possibly, my favorite game of all time is Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The puzzle solving, the storyline, and the action that goes on in that game is so phenomenal, I'm at loss for words. It never gets old. I can still play it any day. I think this game just nukes the entire competition. If you ask me why do you like Super Nintendo better, my answer is Link to the Past. And if that's not enough, Super Metroid. I recommend it hardcore. This is a must-play game. It's a giant maze that you can't stop playing until it's finished. It has a foreboding atmosphere that keeps you tense the whole time. Running around blowing stuff up has never been so much fun. Take your pick, but the winner for me is Super Nintendo. There you have it, Nintendo wins.
it will take centuries to invent something that'll top that.
Give it a few years, Jimmy. So I just wanted to bring you back to a simpler time when there wasn't a care in the world other than defending your favorite console. There's always problems going on in the world and political issues and whatnot, but back then, all we cared about was what's better, Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo. And one thing I do know, the world wouldn't be complete without both of them. Long live the 16 bits.